Today we're meeting Paul French, historian and author of Midnight in Peking and a number of other acclaimed books on real events in Chinese history. Welcome to China Noir.
Paul, you found a way to make crime pay. How did that all come about?
Well, I'm a China historian, really, but what I was looking for was stories that allowed wider audiences to get into China and get a kind of, undercover history lesson, really, without realizing it. And true crime or crime fiction is a really good way to get in there. Everywhere in the world, pretty much, it's the biggest selling genre. Looking around for stories that allowed me to sort of dig around China was fantastic. And of course, the thing about murders, particularly, but also robberies, is all bets are off the table. So, detectives can ask anything. So the fact that, you can really drill down into what's going on in society, what's going on in the power structures, what's going on in the sort of underworld at that time. So it's a really great way of getting a complete slice of the society at the time.
Paul, you're most famous for your best-selling book called Midnight in Peking, which, correct me if I'm wrong, had an unusual aspect in that there was a Chinese police officer working with a British police officer.
Yeah, it's a totally unique case. It's a 19-year-old English girl, the son of a former British diplomat, is murdered in January 1937. And the case of a murdered foreigner is obviously a big news. And it's given to the head of the Chinese detective squad in Peking, Inspector Han Sheching. And he's a very well-known detective in China at that time, multilingual, has had training abroad, I think in Japan, on detective techniques, and was known as the Sherlock Holmes of China. He was always being written about in the newspapers. And he often got these kind of slightly tricky cases. But it also happened that over in Tianjin, in the foreign concessions there was a British policeman who was running the British police, who was a Scotland Yard trained detective and had worked out of Paddington police station in London before coming to China. And so the British asked if he could be involved. Inspector Han said fine. And the two of them worked together. And to my knowledge, and no one's ever corrected me in over 10 years of the book being out, that's the only time that a British detective and a Chinese detective have worked together to try and solve a case. The amazing thing about Inspector Han is, of course, there's this long tradition of cerebral detectives. There's a long tradition of magistrates that precedes, the introduction of Western literature. And then there were the translations of Sherlock Holmes, which took off, like wildfire in China. I mean, they really loved Sherlock Holmes. But interestingly, the Chinese decided to make their own Sherlock Holmes films. And they copied absolutely everything, but with a Chinese actor, filmed at, of course, the famous Shanghai film studios. So the deerstalker hat, the pipe, the bad violin playing, living with a version of Mrs. Hudson, i.e. Hudson, kind of, looking after him, and a kind of equivalent of Dr. Watson as well, working with him. And sadly, these films are lost. The celluloid turns to dust, doesn't it? But there are posters available that you can find on the internet for the Chinese Sherlock Holmes. And it was a very successful film at the time. Inspector Han became famous in Beijing for solving several murders, but then also was sort of rented out almost by the Beijing police at that time to other cities. So he was going around. He did a case down in Guangzhou, another in Xiamen, one up in the west of China. And these were all written up by the newspapers, embellished, I imagine, somewhat. And he was presented as this genius. Well, he does seem to have solved lots of crimes, so I guess that makes you a genius. And he was known as the Sherlock Holmes of China. And this really sort of made his career. There were books published about him. I found articles as far away as kind of what was then the Dutch East Indies, in kind of newspapers in Batavia, now Jakarta, Indonesia, that were writing about him all around the region. People, within Chinese communities in Malaysia, Singapore, and so on, everyone knew of Inspector Han.
So tell us about your new book, which I believe is set in Macau.
Well, I've always been fascinated by Macau. Of course, it's the oldest European colony in Asia, so that makes it fascinating by several hundred years. But also, I was always interested in this idea that there was always a sort of a trope around Macau, that it was, on the one hand, lazy and sort of, lazing in a sort of Mediterranean torpor in the middle of the South China Seas. And yet, on the other hand, was supposed to be the home of all this gambling and vice and organized gangs and all the rest of it. And I think, both of those things can be true, as well as other things can be true as well, that there was also a lot of trade going on, and a lot of people living their lives. But I kind of liked this idea of it as a sort of a sin city, which was picked up by Hollywood, was picked up by other places. And of course, during the war, the neutrality, being a Portuguese colony, it was neutral during the war. So, for instance, there was a British consulate there known as the Lone Flag, which was the only one between India and Australia, after the fall of Hong Kong. So there was all sorts of interesting stuff going on there. It was a nest of spies. There was British intelligence officers coming out, but there were Nazi intelligence officers there. There were Free Chinese guerrillas operating there, but there were also members of Wang Jingwei's collaborationist government operating there. Of course, the Japanese, and then just general pirates who don't really answer to anyone. So the sort of lawlessness of Macau was kind of fascinating when you compare it to somewhere like Shanghai, where there was a definite attempt by municipal authorities to maintain order. Didn't work very well. It became known as Chicago on the Huangpu and all that sort of thing. And in Peking, Beijing, which was of course always China, you had these kind of, the Chinese police trying to enforce control of everything that was going on. And even here in Hong Kong, you had Hong Kong police force that was trying to deal with whoever was coming in and out. And of course, it was a port city, people coming in and out. It's a navy town. There's going to be a bit of trouble. And so, it was all of these great cities of old China had slightly different crimes going on and slightly different ways of policing them.
How did you become so good at investigating past crimes? Do you come from a family of detectives, Paul?
Yeah, I have a brother-in-law who's an ex-detective with the Metropolitan Police in London, and he's kind of a useful sounding board, right? I can kind of throw things at him, like all detectives. He watches all the detective shows on TV and rolls his eyeballs and kind of, says that's not possible, this is not possible. So I try and, get some idea of what the detective thought process is. Also, particularly when I was trying to investigate a crime myself as an amateur in midnight in Peking, there was probably going to be angles I wasn't thinking about, things I was going to miss, things that the police would have checked. And also, it was interesting to think about what you could do now that you couldn't do then. Now, of course, we have so many crimes that are solved by GPS and mobile phone tracking, and we've had several in the UK that were simply from Apple Watch data and things like that of course will tell the exact time your heartbeat stopped and things like that. So, at that time, though, there were interesting techniques which you see in literature of the time as well. That, for instance, they took photographs of the corpses because they believed, as they did in Europe at the time, that the last thing that the person had seen was an image that could be captured on your cornea. They really believed that was possible. Already by the 1930s, they were able to type blood. You could tell if it was the victim's blood, animal blood, or another type of blood. So there was a sort of basic forensics. I could do a little bit of CSI Peking, right? But of course, it was mostly just down to the cerebral. And so this case, the Midnight Peking case, was covered everywhere in the newspapers. Because it was an English girl that was killed, and there was a certain feeling at the time, with the Japanese definitely menacing China, that if a privileged white foreigner could be killed, what the hell chance was there for everybody else?
Author Paul French was in conversation with former detective Toby Bull for Friday Every Day.